Good morning. I call this meeting to order. Today we have the Department of Finance and Treasury Board with us to discuss the Broughton Tax and Regulatory Review. We'll begin with introductions, starting with Mr. Jessam.
Good morning. Ben Jessam here from Hammonds Plains, Lucasville.
Patricia Arab, MLA for Fairview Clayton Park.
Good morning. Margaret Miller for Hants East.
Joachim Stroink, Halifax, Shabakto.
Ian Rankin, Timberley Prospect.
Good morning. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good morning. Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville-Cobequid.
I'd like to welcome our guests here. I'd like for them to introduce themselves, beginning with Mr. Rayfuse.
Good morning. My name is Byron Rayfuse. I'm the Associate Deputy Minister of Finance.
Good morning. I'm Ben Macbeth. I'm a policy analyst with Finance and Treasury Board.
Good morning. I'm Lalani Kumar-Naika. I'm Executive Director of Fiscal Policy, Economics and Budgetary Planning at the Department.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Rayfuse, I'll let you begin with opening comments, and then we'll begin with questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to come here today to speak about the Independent Tax and Regulatory Review report as provided by Ms. Broughton. As I indicated earlier, I have with me Lalani and Ben. Both of them are from the Department of Finance and Treasury Board like myself. The Tax and Regulatory Review was launched with the intent of evaluating our tax system and formulating a plan to support Nova Scotians and business within our province. The review began in February 2014, shortly after the release of the Now and Never report by the Nova Scotia Commission on Building the New Economy, as chaired by Mr. Ray Ivany. The Now or Never report was encouraging the government's commitment to engage in a comprehensive review of our tax policies and measures. Their consultations highlighted some major challenges that face Nova Scotia, and they indicated, having heard from many stakeholders, that the province's tax system was hindering business development and investment in Nova Scotia. On February the 27th, 2014, the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board appointed Laurel Broughton to lead an independent tax and regulatory review. A team of public servants, including myself, supported Ms. Broughton. They came from the Department of Finance and Treasury Board, as well as other government departments. Ms. Broughton was asked to consult with stakeholders and thought leaders to review the province's tax and regulatory system and make recommendations based on the principles of simplicity, fairness, competitiveness, and sustainability. She was tasked with reporting back to government with recommendations indicating how our provincial tax and regulations could promote an environment more conducive to investment, wealth creation, and business expansion in Nova Scotia, and while promoting innovation, productivity, entrepreneurship, and private sector development. Over the course of the spring and the summer, Ms. Broughton met with about 250 stakeholders, including economists, academics, business groups, and others. She traveled throughout Nova Scotia and consulted locally, nationally, and internationally. She also conducted research on current and best practices in other jurisdictions across Canada and beyond. On November the 19th, Ms. Broughton presented her report to the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board. The Minister, along with her colleagues, it will be up to them to determine which of the recommendations are accepted and how they're going to be implemented. I would now be happy to take questions. I just want to remind everybody that in the report, there were 22 tax recommendations, there were 16 regulation recommendations, as well as 4 user fee recommendations. So, Mr. Chair, I'll be happy to take questions now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rayfuse. We'll move to Mr. Houston for 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Rayfuse, for that introduction. I don't know if you noticed on the way in this morning, but there's a sound stage set up and expecting a lot of people on the streets today, so we might as well get right started with the film tax credit and the changes to the film tax credit. How familiar are you with the cost of this credit to the province of Nova Scotia?
Mr. Rayfuse.
I'm quite familiar with the cost of this credit and all the credits we have both on the personal and income tax side, so yes.
Okay, so very familiar. Do you have, would you have access to historical data that shows how much the credit has cost the fiscal framework annually for the past 5 years?
Do we have that with us? I do have that. It costs us around $26 million currently, and that number has grown over the last number of years. I'll give you the exact figures shortly, but I think we actually handed that out as part
Okay.
of our last week as part of our budget.
Okay, yeah, I
deliberations.
would like to see that if we could get that for the last for the last 5 years. That would be good.
Do you want me to bring out the numbers now, or
If you have them right to hand,
I can just speak it out loud?
roughly, sure, yeah.
Mr. Rayfuse.
Okay, for 2014, we estimate we estimate the cost to be about $27 million. 2012, $16 million. 2013, $16 million. 2012, $22 million. Okay, sorry, there's a titling problem here. 13 is $27 million. 2012 is $16 million. 2011 is $22 million. And 2010, $15.5 million.
Mr. Houston.
Okay, thank you for that. So how familiar are you with the history of the credit, like how it's changed over time? Are you pretty familiar with how this credit has evolved over the last decade, I guess?
Yeah. The credit itself has made a number of changes, both in the base rate and also from the once including a cap to an exclusion of a cap, and then the introduction of what we refer to as eligible geographic area bonuses, as well as frequent filming bonuses that came into play over the number of years. I can walk those through with you if you want, and kind of a historical look at this. So that up from 1994 to June 1998, there was a base rate of 30% included in the tax rate, with a production cost to cap of 15%. In June 98, that changed to a 32.5% base rate to a production cap cost of 16.25%, and that remained in place until April 2000. In April 2000, the base rate moved to 30% with the introduction of the eligible geographical bonus of 5% and a production cap, cost cap of 15%. And that stayed into place until 2005. In 2005, the base rate was moved to 35%. The eligible geographical bonus stayed at 5%, but we introduced the frequent filming bonus at 5% with a production cost cap of 17.5%. That stayed in place until October 2007. In 2007, the base rate moved to 50%, with the eligible geographic bonus increasing to 10%, and the frequent filming bonus remaining at 5%, with a cap increasing to 25%. And that stayed in place until 2010. In 2010, the base rate stayed at 50%. The eligible geographic bonus stayed at 10%. Frequent bonus stayed at 5%, but the cap was removed. And that's what stayed in place until the current regime is in place.
So were you involved over time as this was being changed?
My involvement previously would have been, because I was at the Department of Finance. I've been at the Department of Finance since about 2005. I would have been involved in those budgetary matters from the changes from 2005.
Okay, so pretty familiar with how this credit has evolved. How familiar are you with how the credit is used by industry to carry out their productions? Are you pretty familiar with how industry uses this credit?
We have a good understanding about how the industry structures itself, both from a financing, a legal, and accounting-wise. I understand they use production, individual number of companies for production purposes, for the purposes of applying the tax credit to obtain financing. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, page 4 of the guidelines for applying for the credit on the finance website indicates that it's a labor-based credit, and it says right on there that it's the Nova Scotia Film Industry Tax Credit is a labor-based incentive designed to encourage employment of Nova Scotians and is available to local and guest producers. It is calculated based on an applicant company's eligible salaries included in the making of eligible film. So the website provides a series of forms that must be completed in order to be eligible for a refund. 7 forms, in fact. One of them is called the Declaration of Residency. Are you familiar with that form?
Yes, I am.
So that on that form, it makes it very clear that the people benefiting from the refund are tax-paying Nova Scotians who must include their social insurance number on the declaration. Does the Department of Finance verify these forms?
Those forms are a part of the application that goes into the creative industries. They would have those forms on file. We would not see those forms.
Okay, so so you don't have any analysis that goes through those forms, and because from the information on those forms, you know the people, you know their social insurance numbers, you could figure out how much tax they pay. Has any type of analysis ever been done like that?
We would not do analysis on the individual taxes. When we determine the taxes associated or taxes paid from this industry, we would use our, I'm going to call it a more holistic yield amount. As opposed to going to every individual's tax returns, we would look at the number and the salary associated with that on a more, I'm going to call it more holistic basis as opposed to an individual basis.
So the information's available, but nobody's really doing an analysis of it.
On an individual basis, no, that would not be appropriate for us to do it on an individual basis. Our analysis is based on a more holistic view of tax paying and tax spending analysis and forms.
And you say it wouldn't be appropriate to do it for all those individuals. How many individuals would there be? How many of those forms would you have received?
I'm going to ask Lalani to answer that.
Ms. Komura-Noyaki.
It depends on the production. For example, one production could have has had up to 19 pages in terms of a spreadsheet, because you have a large number of folks involved in production, so individually. We also have a separate spread. If you look at the application form, there's a separate sheet for third-party costs, and there's different rates that are eligible for that. So that includes equipment rentals, all sorts of things like that. In the attempt to streamline administration related to the film tax credit over the past year or so, what the department has done is worked with film and creative industries to avoid duplication. And so what we have done is Film and Creative Industries has received all of the application materials, including things like the declaration. To streamline our processing, we try to avoid two people doing the same job.
I guess the nature of my question is that how can you be certain that the measures proposed by this budget, where we're going to get into what type of analysis was done, but to me this seems like a pretty significant bit of information that was available for analysis. You know how many Nova Scotians are receiving money through this credit through their labor compensation, but that's not something that you look at.
Mr. Rafuse.
To be clear, sir, I didn't say we didn't look at it. We don't look at it at an individual basis. We look at it and the way we analyze all our tax information. We use, I'm going to call it holistic kinds of yield and returns about the number of individuals and the amount of salaries they earn and the taxes we would generate from that. Not on an individual basis, because we would have to go and pull everybody's individual claim to do that.
So the ability from the forms is there to follow the money, so to speak. You know the reach and impact of the tax credit, and you've done a holistic approach, an overview, let's say, of the impact to the economy of that. But you haven't really, in making this change, you didn't really kind of say, well, we're going to change this credit. We should dig a little deeper. You kind of relied on the analysis that was just happening anyway. Would that be a fair statement? Was there any digging deeper before this change was made?
Mr. Rafuse.
I don't know what you mean by digging deeper. The analysis on what the return is from an incremental tax perspective is an ongoing process. It involves looking at the labor component of the eligible salaries associated with this tax credit. We determine the incremental provincial tax associated with this, also the incremental consumption tax around HST associated with their spend, and the corporate income taxes that are generated from corporations as industries that pay corporate tax. That is an ongoing process as we evaluate these taxes. We do not do it on an individual basis. We do it on our tax yield calculations that are appropriate for this type of analysis.
Okay,
We
so
can
we'll-
and have looked at certain individuals that would be outliers on this process.
I guess the issue is and I want to come to it in a second, but there's a lot of discrepancy as to what's the value to our economy of this credit. So you have a number from your analysis, and there's industry has a number, and there's other numbers. So in the face of that, I guess what I was trying to figure out is, did you do more analysis to see how this disconnect? But I'm gonna come to that, and I just want to ask specifically about the change to this credit in this budget. Did you do analysis that compared the value of the credit to Nova Scotia as compared with other provinces?
Mr. Rayfuse.
Yeah, a cross-jurisdictional comparison of the support for the film industry has been done for comparing ourselves to provincial and other United States. So that analysis was complete. It's an ongoing process for us.
Okay, so that would be the analysis of what the actual credit available is. I'm wondering, is there an analysis that looked at what economic activity the credit produced? So if you looked at the structure we have in Nova Scotia, you have a number for how much economic activity that credit produced or generated. Other provinces have their own credits. Did you compare how much economic activity their credits, like to see who's kind of getting the best bang for the buck, I guess? Did you look across jurisdictions to see who was having the most effective credit?
We would not have done the analysis ourselves. We relied on other provinces that have released analysis on the effectiveness of their tax credit. I think most recently, the government of Manitoba has just released a report of the effect that their credit has on their economy and what it means to them. Other provinces have done so in
Right,
the
so did you
past.
compare those? Did you compare all those? Is there a nice spreadsheet that says Manitoba did this, here's what they say, how much economic, we do this is what we say? Was that comparison done?
That comparison would be done on a report basis. We don't have a spreadsheet. We have a spreadsheet that shows what their credit looks like and how they support the industry, but we let the provinces' study stand on their own.
So in deciding how to change the tax credit in Nova Scotia, it wasn't really a factor in your decision as to how things were working in other provinces?
The decision, those types of decisions, there's a lot of factors that are considered when the government makes a decision about what it supports from an expenditure or tax credit perspective. What others do and their priorities of the government and the fiscal position of the province are all factors that are considered when you're looking at evaluating a change into a tax credit.
Right, and I guess there should be a lot of factors that go into those decisions, and I guess what I'm worried about is that not enough factors were evaluated in changing this credit. So that's something that I was wondering, was there an analysis? And I would have expected this just to be a simple spreadsheet that had the provinces and what their credit was and the economic activity. People could see what others were doing, but it sounds like that specific analysis was not done. And instead, the credit changes were proposed after just looking in the silo of what was happening here, and I think that would be unfortunate if that's the case. But I do want to ask, on June 13th, 2014, the Nova Scotia Motion Picture Industry Association submitted a position paper to Laurel Broughton. Are you familiar with their submission?
Mr. Rayfuse.
Yes, I'm familiar with it. I did read the report, and it was put under consideration when Ms. Broughton wrote her report.
Sure. So on page 10 of that submission, the Nova Scotia Motion Picture Industry says that in 2013, the approximate $25 million dispersed in provincial film and television tax credits. So they say 25 million, and that was pretty close to the number you gave me earlier of 27. but they say that that 25 million generated 124 million in production. So that's a pretty big return on that investment for the economy. It's a $99 million of triggered capital net investment, let's say, 396% return on investment if you were looking at it in those terms. Was this data considered in your advice to seriously alter the tax credit?
The size of the spend of the industry which was included in that report and our analysis as well. Those types of spending activities are I don't think we say that there's disagreement. I don't think there's a great disagreement on the size of the industry here. But when we look at it evaluating a tax credit, we look at the size of the industry that is supported by the tax credit, and that number that's quoted in the report is the entire industry in Nova Scotia, which there are aspects of that which are not supported by the tax credit, and we don't take that into consideration.
To that point, actually, Mr. Leahy asked me this question. He was wondering, would you have done any analysis on the value to the Nova Scotia promotion of Nova Scotian in general, and to the benefits to tourism? Would you ever looked at if that's the industry number, there's probably a positive spin-off on tourism and general promotion of the province. Is that something that you would have been factored into the decision?
As I said, the decisions to change the tax credit, there's a lot of things that go in play that are considered with that. We look at the financial return to the province from an incremental revenue perspective. You're talking about the economical impact of peripheral aspects which are hard to quantify. To be honest with you, whether or not it has a
But do you look at
those?
You look at those factors within the walls of the Finance and Treasury Board?
Our advice to the government on these matters is on the incremental provincial tax revenues associated with the tax credit, and not those kind of, I'm going to call it the peripheral benefits. That there is an acknowledgement that there would be some of that, but that's not something that we would factor into our analysis.
So if that wouldn't be part of your analysis, would you agree that it should be part of somebody's analysis? Like you have a specific mandate in your role, and you provide analysis, and you submit that to the
I'm quite sure that the people that made the decision would take that into consideration when they're evaluating changes, like we would on the incremental size, incremental tax revenue, we would with the...
Did you ever participate in a discussion about this tax credit where there was a bunch of people sitting around the table, and you said, here's my analysis, and other people said, and here's our analysis, and here's what we think? Did you ever have a discussion like that where people were bringing different perspectives to possible changes to the tax credit?
When we are completing our analysis of the effectiveness of the tax credit as it's currently designed, we would be talking with creative industries about what their thoughts about what the tax credit meant to the industry, what it meant on that broader perspective, and what changes would have been to the industry.
So did you have those discussions
With
personally?
with creative industries. I was not involved in all those discussions, nor was I involved in all the deliberations the Treasury Board or Cabinet would have had on the discussions around changing a tax measure.
How am I doing?
You have about 20 seconds, Mr. Houston.
In 20 seconds, I will pass to my honourable
Okay, we'll now move
colleague.
to the NDP with Ms. McDonald. And Ms. McDonald, perhaps you could introduce yourself as well.
Yes, thank you. Maureen McDonald, MLA, Halifax Needham. Good morning. Thank you for being here. It's a very timely visit to the Public Accounts Committee from our friends in the Department of Finance. Today's topic, of course, is the Broughton tax review, and I think people in the province today are particularly focused on the film industry and the digital media tax credits, which are very small component of this review, but I want to read the recommendations, which I know the deputy would be very aware of, but maybe not everybody is. The recommendations from the tax review say the following. Recommendation 1.13. The regulatory framework and detailed elements of both the Nova Scotia tax credit and the digital media tax credit should be better aligned with similar tax measures in other Canadian jurisdictions. Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia should be solely responsible for the administration of both tax credits. Industry and the province should use the period leading up to the sunset of the two credits in 2020 to determine the most effective tools to grow the creative economy in Nova Scotia and transition the tax credits to departmental expenditure programs that are transparent, accountable, and focused on economic growth. So those were the recommendations, and here we are. We find ourselves in a situation where certainly the last two of those recommendations have been somewhat hijacked by the budget that the government introduced. Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia no longer exists. It's been assassinated, and it's gone. So the body that Broughton recommended administer the tax credits, the body that she says in her report has the knowledge and the expertise around this industry, doesn't exist anymore. And the whole idea of transitioning to 2020, extending for 5 years the existing credit and working with the industry over a 5-year period has been collapsed into 3 months, and given the meeting with the minister on Wednesday, further collapsed to 3 days. The industry are expected, according to the Premier, to come back with a plan on Friday. I don't know what to say when I look at these recommendations and a report that is quite thorough and rests on information that was provided by the Department of Finance. So I guess that's the first thing I would ask you to confirm. The information contained in the 2 pages on the film tax credit in the tax review, including, you know, the way the tax review at a very high level works and what have you. This information was all primarily provided to Ms. Broughton by the Department of Finance and by Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia. Is that not the case?
Mr. Rayfuse.
Generally speaking, the information that Ms. Broughton used to write a report would kind of work like this. If she had a request for an analytical piece of work to be completed, that we were able to do so, we would complete that work for her. She did meet with a number of economists and others, of which would have provided her some insight from their perspective as well. And she would have had received submissions over the life of the report, and she would take those and combine those things together to formulate her report. So some of it which came from us, some analytic work, whatever kind of work, if she asked for a piece of work to be analyzed or to go out and do a jurisdictional scan or do an impact of this or that, that's where we would come into play, and if we had the ability and resources to do so, we would.
So would you provide this committee with the analysis that you submitted to Ms. Broughton with respect to these tax credits? I think it would be very useful for us to have an opportunity to look at that analysis. I know you indicated that it's an ongoing process, but for that point, at that point in time, I think it's important for members of the legislature to have that information.
Certainly, there was a lot of research that was conducted in the course of this report, and certainly it is an independent report. I'm thinking within my ability to provide to you that kind of research, we certainly will. I do not have that with me at this time, but if you're looking for particular for the tax, film tax credit, or are you looking for all the resources?
I'm looking specifically at the film tax credit and the digital tax credit.
Okay.
Information.
Certainly, and just for clarity, there is no proposed changes to the digital tax credit in this year's budget, but the analysis that was completed for that, it would have been, as I said, it would have been back to the historical aspect of this, what other jurisdictions have done, the impact that would have on her thoughts, and some suggestions she would have received elsewhere, of which we would not have the ability to provide you that type of research.
So I guess the other thing that I have some concern about, and I don't think it's necessarily fair to put this to you, but I want to put it on the record. The first recommendation with respect to aligning tax measures in this province to tax measures for this industry in other provinces, it leads me to the question of what would be our competitive advantage if we did that. If we suddenly had the same set of regulatory and monetary incentives as Ontario, let's say, Quebec, BC, bigger provinces, bigger GDPs, more diversified economies, significant other industries resting on resources than our own, and we take a sector that is robust and growing and important to our economy, and we eviscerate the tax credit system so that we put ourselves at a less competitive position. It doesn't really make sense to me, and I'm wondering if somebody could help me understand the sense of that.
Mr. Rayfuse.
A comment I made is in the context of this report, the notion of better aligning it with similar tax jurisdictions, it is recognized that the regime we had in Nova Scotia was the most generous in Canada, and that's where that comment came from. Other tax programs in other provinces are designed to maybe to incent some of the uniqueness that they wish to have in their industry. Some may be geared to, I'm going to call feature motion pictures as opposed to other aspects. Certainly on the digital side of the house, some provinces have chosen to invest in certain strategies that would be more different. So it would be difficult to say how that would affect our competitiveness, I would think, given that they have chosen certain aspects of which they wish to incent, as opposed to a more general kind of perspective we may have here in Nova Scotia.
Since the Broughton report and the analysis that you prepared for her around this particular tax credit, you indicate that the tax analysis is ongoing. Did the department prepare additional or update the analysis that was available to her for this report for the finance minister and for Treasury Board and Cabinet with respect to the budget, the development of the budget?
Certainly, and it's just for your benefit, as while this report was ongoing, there was also program review underway within the province of Nova Scotia, And the genesis for changes for the tax credit actually did generate out of the program review, which looked at all government spending and our tax credits. So yes, there was other analysis done, and yes, there are always other options which are presented for consideration.
Would the analysis that you've prepared be available to our committee?
I'm not able to provide to you the other options that were presented to government. Those types of things are for cabinet deliberations or Treasury Board deliberations. I can only speak to the options which they have chosen to follow.
So it's a secret what the options other options might have been that were considered. That's unfortunate. You know, I think people are really trying to understand the thinking of the government with respect to this film tax credit. I want to ask you about something that I'm quite curious about, following the questions from my colleague here to my left, which I'm sure he'll like that characterization. The question I have is, you know, you indicated you look at the direct cost and benefit of this industry with respect to the cost of the tax credit, the amount of public dollars that are invested, and then on the revenue side, corporate tax, personal income tax, and I think you said consumption tax that's directly related to the industry, but you don't look at kind of the multiplier effect. Is that an accurate interpretation of what you indicated earlier?
Not entirely. When we look at the incremental revenue to the province, we do incorporate the multiplier effect that this economy would have, or the spend in the greater economy of Nova Scotia. We would consider that.
And is that is that done by the economic unit, the Thomas and the brainiacs and the economic unit over there in finance?
Yeah, that we would rely on our economics group to do the economic impact associated with that level of spend. And then we would, as we do with all our revenues, hand that over to our revenue side to decide to determine the actual incremental revenue associated for the province.
And is that analysis, that information available to this committee?
Mr. Rafuse?
Yeah. We actually are attempting to be able to find a way to release that to you, because we use information provided to us by Stat Canada, and we need their authorization to release that type of multiplier impact, which they have, I'm going to call proprietary ownership with, and we use it, but we can't release it, so we're attempting to do that for you.
Thank you. That would be most helpful. The other thing that I am wondering about with respect to this tax credit, you know, having been in the Department of Finance for a nanosecond, for a very brief period, and having had an opportunity to learn a bit about the film tax credit, you know, in this business, there's so much, in the political business, there's so much happening all the time. Your memory sometimes can play tricks on you, but my recall is that, in fact, I had quite a lengthy discussion with the former Deputy Minister about doing a comprehensive economic assessment that went beyond the number crunching from within the Department of Finance. Not that there was anything wrong with the number crunching within the Department of Finance, but It was confusing for me as a layperson, not in the industry, to have information, be briefed about how this credit works on one day, and then seeing Nova Scotia Business Inc. CEO the next day in the media talk about the value of this industry, and there was a disconnect between the information I was getting. So, as somebody who likes to have clarity, I'm quite sure we had lengthy discussions about having a thorough, comprehensive review to get some clarity around the competing discourse around what the actual benefit, cost and benefit of this industry, this sector, was in the province. And my understanding was, and I'm quite sure there were meetings occurred at very high levels between officials in the Department of Finance and officials in what was then the Department of Economic Rural Development and the Creative Industries division, I guess I would say. So that's quite a long time ago. That's almost 2 years ago. Had no work been done on that? It seems to me that there probably was a fair amount of work done, perhaps even some reports. And so that's my question. Was there work done between those two divisions? Was there any clarity reached? Were there reports done? At what stage might those reports have been left? And I'll stop there for the moment.
Mr. Rafuse.
That study that you're talking about, we're thinking about, was not completed. That kind of, I'm going to call it that more comprehensive view of what the industry means to the economy. The last time that was done in Nova Scotia was 2004. We referred to that study as the North City report that had certain analysis and conclusions drawn in it. That's the same organization that recently did the one that I spoke of earlier that was released by the province of Manitoba, but that type of review was not completed by the province in the time frame you're talking about.
Ms. McDonald.
Thank you. So it wasn't completed, but it was initiated. I know it was initiated. Was there any work done at all on it? And at what stage would the work have proceeded to? Like, were there drafts? Was there a draft report?
Mr. Rafuse.
I'm quite certain there was not a draft report done. I don't think anything proceeded along that advanced. I just know that not aware of anything actually starting, so therefore the report couldn't have been completed, so there would not have been a draft that I'm aware of.
So we don't have any comprehensive understanding of this industry based on that kind of study since 2004?
That was the last time that type of study we were talking about.
Since 2004. Okay, that concludes my questions for the moment. I know my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McDonald, and we'll now move to Mr. Rankin in the Liberal Caucus for 20 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for coming in. So the minister had consultations for this tax report, and I know I held consultations beforehand in my area before the report was released and submitted my opinions on the tax system. I'm just wondering if you can tell the committee how you judge effectiveness of tax credits and from the perspective of the department, what does a tax credit, what's the impetus behind a tax credit, and is the nature of them are they supposed to be a permanent system in place, or what brings the tax credit on? What is the main reason, and how do you measure the effectiveness?
Mr. Rayfuse.
There's probably kind of two broad reasons why there are tax credits put in our tax system, and one I would suggest to you is more of a societal type of benefit to redistribute tax revenues from one taxpayer to another. And I'm going to put something like the volunteer firefighters tax credit into that type of category for social societal tax credits. And there's others which are used to provide other types of incentive or change behavior, or to provide some economic benefit. In fact, if you recall in the actual report, Ms. Broughton actually lists a lot of reasons why why tax credits or tax measures are put in place. A lot of things from a very prestigious professor here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Gorman, who taught at St. Mary's for a number of years, and talk about the need to or the desire to incent certain behavior or to change spending patterns and the like. So that's the type of the secondary reason why you would put into those types of tax changes. We measure tax effectiveness or effectiveness of a tax credit by the incrementality of the measure. So in the same way we evaluate payroll rebates, we look at the amount of incremental spend in the economy that the tax measure supports. And then we look at the incremental revenue to the province associated with that by looking at incremental personal income tax, incremental consumption or HST tax, and incremental corporate income tax associated with the amount of that incentive. And we can make a comparison. Our test is generally around, it should be at the break-even basis from that measure. And then because of the, I'm going to call it the more harder to measure benefits associated with such a thing, then that would be an additional overlay that would be from a public policy perspective. So when we look at a tax credit like the film tax credit, which we say to roughly around $25 million a year, which creates the industry spends that money on an eligible cost. We look at the incremental taxes generated from that, and from that analysis, we would say for that $25 million, we get incremental taxes in around the $6 million range, and that's where we would come to the conclusion for that. From that perspective, that would be an ineffective tax credit.
Okay, and so for the payroll rebate that you mentioned, and obviously the latest one that's in the news that is being misconstrued as being comparable to the film industry tax credit is the RBC taxable rebate system in the payroll, which members of the opposition have said that they're against. And as last night, one of them said that there was a check written from the government for $22 million to the RBCs. I'm just wondering if there was a check for $22 million written, if you can clarify that, how that works. And further to that, is there incremental tax revenue that's brought in should they meet that $22 million of rebate?
The way that incentive works is a payroll rebate, so they need to hire before they get the rebate. So no, there was not a check sent to RBC for that initiative. And so when we looked at the effectiveness of that one, we would look at the incremental spend associated with those types of hires and determine the extra tax revenue associated with it. That rebate was in the 8 to 10% range. We would generate more incremental taxes from that.
Right. So if they were to achieve $22 million in rebate, how much incremental tax revenue would be coming in off that? Do you have that number?
Yeah, I don't have that with us, but it was, as I say, when we provided that analysis to NSPI, who provided that tax rebate, we would have done an economic impact analysis associated with that spend and determined that level of rebate we would determine as effective.
But it's safe to say that more revenue would be coming into the province that would be rebated for.
If they do the hires that they are.
Yes.
So if they don't get the hires, they don't get the 22
That's
million
right.
anyway.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. And I think what's the other thing that's lost in this is the new $6 million fund that's set up for creative industries. Up until this budget, there's no opportunity for people that are in book publishing and some of the other creative industries. So I'm just wondering, because that's kind of been drowned out with some of the other feedback, I'm just wondering if you can explain who that's eligible for and what are the new types of industries that will now have access to that fund.
That fund, which comes into play in next fiscal year, is the book publishing industry, is publishers are available. It's also to honor the government's commitment around supporting the sound industry. So that industry will be able to make access to that fund, as well as the film industry as well. The criteria and the parameters of which people can access that is something which have not been completely worked out. That the minister has said that we'll continue to work with industry on that, but it does open up the fund to other sectors that didn't have availability for funding from the province.
Okay, and just one more question surrounding the film industry and the numbers that you were able to provide to the public and to the industry. Has I know that the minister and the premier has met with some stakeholders, and I'm not sure how the department is engaged in any analysis with that, but before that time or up until now, even has there been any credible challenge to the numbers that were presented out of the Department of Finance in terms of the return on investment?
Certainly, we would have, before we actually released such numbers, we would have done our own internal QA on those types of things. We stand behind those numbers. It's our standard way of evaluating the effectiveness of an incentive program like that. I say we look at the incremental revenue associated with it. It is the same process we use when we evaluate any type of thing like that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. We'll move to Mr. Stroink.
Thank you very much for coming today. I guess, you know, we've been chatting a lot about the film tax credit, but you also, when you started your speech, you also talked about the other two components of this, and one was the user fees and one was the regulatory piece. So I guess for me, and I know I'm sure there's going to be, my colleagues will ask many more questions about the film industry. I just want to kind of touch on a bit on the user fees and how, was that a recommendation to increase that? How did that, in the report, how did that affect your decision of where we are with the user fees and the increases of user fees?
Mr. Rafuse.
Certainly, on the user fee side of the report, there actually are 4 recommendations. And it came in, the recent increase in user fees, which are tied to cost of living adjustments for the last 2 years, does play into the recommendations. The recommendations does indicate that the government should move to full cost recovery on user fees. And this is an attempt to better capture the full cost of those fees. It also indicates that the government should adopt I'm going to call it a common methodology around costing of programs and the costing of fees, of which we get a better understanding. We're quite confident, in fact, we have to declare that the fees don't exceed the cost associated with providing that service. But I would, it's probably fair to say that in a number of circumstances, the total cost is not being recovered. So the minister has indicated that a review of user fees will be undertaken this year, and we will do a kind of comprehensive review of all our fees and the costs associated with them, determine whether or not the fee structure is appropriate, or in some circumstances, as the report indicates, where perhaps fees do not or should not be charged from a public policy perspective.
And I guess also with that, I mean, you said the recommendations go to a full cost recovery kind of program. Where do we sit now in the numbers of how much are we actually collecting to cover those costs that we are using with those user fees now?
Mr. Rafuse?
Yeah. I don't have the total number of user fees. It's broken down by department, so you could actually talk. This increase here generated an extra about $7.7 million of fees on the $1,400 fees that were impacted. So it's if you think that's about a 3% increase of the base, so you can kind of get the size of the user fee.
So that would cover maybe 20% of total cost of the user fees program, or?
The difficulty is that we don't have a good handle on that. in some circumstances, I would suggest to you, and actually there was some fees that were raised larger than 3% because there was an analysis done to say the current fee is nowhere close to collecting the cost of the service. So those fees went up more than 3%. What the minister is proposing is going across all of them and getting a better determination about what the true cost is and where it is still appropriate from a public policy perspective to continue the fee. The fee will be adjusted to a more appropriate level.
Okay. And I guess from there, I kind of want to move on to the regulatory piece, because that also has a huge impact on the business community primarily. So I guess my ask is, on the regulatory piece, where do we sit with that? What are the changes that are looking to happen there?
The recommendations kind of are kind of pushing government to kind of move forward on the regulatory reform basis. There had been some changes in the past, and to be honest with you, has kind of slowed down a bit. But the recommendations indicated that the drive for regulatory reform should be housed into a single entity, and that there should be kind of an impact assessment on regulations and what it means to individuals and businesses. And the government has moved forward with that by creating the Office of Regulatory Reform within the new office, Department of Business. In fact, it's gone beyond what the report has kind of indicated, and it's indicated, the province has indicated that we're going to work with the province of New Brunswick to better align our regulations between the two jurisdictions to address some concerns about some businesses that work in both, about the different regulatory regimes. And so that's kind of going beyond. So the government has accepted every recommendation in the report on the regulatory side and is moving forward on it.
And I guess part of that regulatory piece is also spending control. My understanding is that when government is spending and spending and spending, we also have to need to rein in their spending to adjust to within our means. And I think part of that regulatory is going to help with that. And my understanding is to try to help focus this government into putting our money where we can enhance other programs.
Certainly that would be the objective on any kind of things on the regulatory burden is to reduce costs on the government, but the primary focus on regulatory reform is to reduce the burden on business so they have the ability to invest or their spending on things other than meeting the regulatory demands of the province. But so there'll be a kind of a twofold benefit from that perspective.
Gotcha. I guess I also kind of going to move on to another topic sort of thing, which there's been a lot of discussion within the carbon tax kind of area. And I guess yesterday, provincial and territorial leaders met in the Quebec City to discuss Canadian energy strategy, and we heard Ontario and Quebec are joining forces to put a cap-and-trade system. And I guess, you know, part of the tax review was the carbon tax and discussion about that. Where are we with that whole plan in Nova Scotia? I mean, there was a big editorial in the paper today talking about it, so where do we sit with this?
Certainly over the winter, when the minister was out doing her public consultations on the report and her pre-budget consultation, the discussion did include a notion of a carbon tax and how it would look in Nova Scotia. I would say we're in kind of early days on that discussion. There certainly has to be a lot more dialogue with stakeholders and within government about how a tax on carbon or a tax would be developed in Nova Scotia. The report talks about the BC model, which has been highly regarded as an effective tax measure, both from a fair way to price your carbon emissions, but at the same time reducing the overall burden in other areas to make your tax structure more competitive. And by law in BC, everything they gather in a carbon tax has to be used to reduce either personal or corporate taxes for others. So as it is a redistribution of the tax system, it's been, as I say, that's a high regard. It's been thought as one of the world leaders in that type of area. So we would need to do further analysis with our counterparts in the Department of Environment and the likewise about how would such a structure be developed in Nova Scotia if it is decided to go down a tax, a carbon tax, or even if the decision is to go into a cap and trade regime, both of which have the same impact as you price your carbon and and people pay for that carbon to the betterment of to others. So it is just a realignment process. So there is some ongoing work. I think the minister has indicated that she would want to speak to Nova Scotians more about the carbon tax. There was a fair amount of discussion, I would say, at those public sessions about the benefits and the drawbacks of a carbon tax. The report does indicate how somebody who is negatively impacted, particularly in the lower income thresholds, how you could redistribute things through the affordable living tax credit or other means through the tax system to compensate those who may be adversely affected by a carbon tax.
And so I guess, you know, the big thing with the BC model, I mean, they achieved a revenue neutral model, and I think that's kind of what you're speaking to here, is it not?
Certainly, a revenue neutral model is not only what BC is employed, but it's what, if you talk to an economist, is what you must do. So there is not a drag on the economy by imposing higher taxes. Is that you actually shift your taxes, and it creates actually a lift in your economy by having reduced corporate or personal taxes by being neutral in that perspective. It actually has proven to be quite, as I said, in BC, quite beneficial, and they're actually kind of one of the leading economies in Nova Scotia and in Canada right now. So,
and I guess one of the things that the big industries have seemed to have been able to adjust to this, especially heavy carbon companies have adjusted to this model. And do you have an understanding how they're doing that within this new constraints that they're working within?
well, they're adjusting it by two ways: is that they're recouping their costs either through their pricing, but also they would be benefiting from a reduced corporate tax that would be associated with their industry. So they adjust, the market adjusts, and as I said, the residents of BC have adjusted by the methodology and the process where they pay their taxes. So it worked out well. Their emissions are down, and their taxes their general taxes are down. Both objectives were met in BC.
How much time do I have left?
You have just less than 2 minutes.
I guess, and for me, and I think, you know, most jurisdictions are moving to a carbon tax model of some sort, even on a global footprint within Europe and the United States. Is this what you're seeing? Is this a common theme across on a global footprint?
Certainly in places like Europe, it's much more prevalent when you see North America, but you do see North America moving in this direction. You do see generally jurisdictions moving to consumption-based taxes away from income-based taxes, which was a consistent theme in the report, that the carbon tax would be consistent with that view as well. Those who consume pay, not just those who earn. So yeah, you will see this jurisdictional change, a shift predominantly in Europe, and I believe also you will see it in I'd call it the Australia, New Zealand areas as well. They've kind of shifted in this area as well. And in fact, I believe China is moving into a carbon taxing regime over the next little while as well.
Great. I think it's probably my time. Thank you very much for those answers.
Thank you, Mr. Stroink. There is about a minute, Ms. Miller, if you had a quick question, or we can move back to the PC caucus.
So we'll move back.
Okay, we'll move to the PC caucus and Mr. Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we left off, we were talking kind of about the quantitative analysis that may have been done for the changes to the film tax credit. And I don't want to use my my time here, but I would ask through you, Mr. Chair, if maybe we could get some documentation afterwards with some numbers on total, your view of the total production dollars spent in Nova Scotia, total eligible salaries, total financing, total value of tax credit expenditure, average percentage of labor claimed, It's a maximum of 65, so the average, and then total number of projects. And these are all things that people have to specify right on the application forms. So if we could maybe see some aggregation of that, and appreciate that. So on this credit, this is a refundable credit. It's not upfront money. And it takes a certain amount of time, I'm sure, to process these applications after the fact. Do you have an average processing time statistic? How long I've heard from industry, sometimes it takes up to 2 years to get the money. Do you have a rule of thumb that you guys understand as to how quickly these applications are processed?
And it's kind of different than the time it takes from the time.
Yeah,
they do the production.
let's focus on when the cash goes back to the applicant. How long does it take them to get paid?
Mr. Rayfuse?
So the application process, if I understand it correctly, is by the time they make their final application to receive their tax certificate, is it's less than a year that process takes. When they actually file their taxes to get their refund, I can't specify. It's when they actually get the cash in hand.
Okay,
so
fair
that would be
enough.
up to them.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, thank you. So let's talk about specifically how the changes to the film tax credit that came about in the budget, how they developed. So we know that the minister signaled at a Chamber of Commerce event that the film tax credit was on the table. And from that day to today, people in industry certainly say that it wasn't, in strict interpretation, the credit wasn't axed, but the industry certainly feels like it was. So I just want to step back even before the Chamber of Commerce. To your knowledge, when did talk of changing this particular tax credit, when did that begin? When's the first time you heard talk in the hallways or in the boardrooms of, hey, let's make some change to the film tax credit? Can you recall when that was?
I can't give you specifics on when that started, but the review of all government spending and our tax credit expenses was initiated last year by government. This was part of that review.
So sometime within the last year.
Yeah, but as I said earlier, we analyze the impact of our tax credits on an ongoing basis. That would have been part of every year's preparation, and we would have made that information available for decision.
So are you aware of, I'm just wondering how it went, like, are you aware, like, did the minister come to your department and say, show me some stuff on how we can change the film tax credit, or did it go the other way, that the department went to the minister and said, hey, I think we should change the film tax credit? Do you remember how it was initiated?
I think this is kind of an iterative process, is when we're looking at all the government's looking at all its spending, it would have been part of that process. We would have just given to the minister, not only the minister, but the Treasury Board and the Program Review Committee, here is the government spending by broad categories on the departmental side, as well as the tax credits.
Okay, thank you. So there's a list of things on the table. There's a list of items to be looked at, and somebody circled this one and said, let's focus on this one, because certainly not everything on that was brought forward would have been acted. We know the volunteer firefighters wasn't acted upon. We know that HST. So somebody circled this one and said, let's go with that one. Was that at the department's urging, or was that the minister said this looks like a good place to go?
I don't think we urged the government to go one direction or another in any of these types of things. What we would have provided is our analysis of the effectiveness of the tax credit, as we would with all tax credits.
Okay. So to your knowledge, when the minister spoke at the Chamber of Commerce, this was obviously something that there'd been discussions about prior to that luncheon. After the luncheon, there was some feedback from the community and from industry, and then we saw the budget. Did the swift response of the industry to the comments at the Chamber of Commerce impact the resulting proposal that went to the minister? Do you recall, was there a lot of changes that happened in that time?
The items included in the budget are a process that takes months to develop. I'm not going to get into when final decisions were made on which items and when. I don't think that would be
Okay, well,
appropriate.
I'll ask it another way. I respect that. So between the Chamber of Commerce lunch and the date that the budget was delivered, changes were made to this film tax credit, and that was and changes were made to other credits. Would you say that, or were other changes were made as well, or was everything done before the Chamber of Commerce?
So again, I'm not going to get into when the change was, the final decisions were made. You may want to ask the minister that. Is
Okay.
that we have a process to develop a budget, and we have a process where our revenues are evaluated by the Auditor General. Those types of decisions would have been incorporated into that
Okay.
process.
Okay. So there's a very specific date in the changes to this, July 1st. July 1st is an important filming. Turns out it's an important date in the filming business. So why was July 1st considered an appropriate day to change the structure of the credit? I mean, lots of times we see these things at the end of the year, December or something. July 1st kind of popped off the page at me. Do you remember what's the, what were you trying to, what was the department, what was the minister trying to accomplish by picking the date of July 1st? Do you know what the reason for that was?
If you recall that in our budget for this year, 15-16, the amount of the tax credit remains relatively the same. From the advice we were getting from the creative industries, film and creative industries, was that most of the filming that we were aware of that were eligible for the credit would be in principal photography by July the 1st, and as long as they're in principal photography at that point, even if it extends beyond that time, they would be under the old tax regime.
Okay, so you're trying to minimize the
It gives them
impact
time to adjust
for
to
this
it,
year.
yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, with considering the changes that were put forth in the budget, that were tabled with the budget, did you do any kind of economic modeling of what's going to be the, how big the industry is going to be in the province after that tax credit? So we talked before about all kinds of modeling of the old structure. Did we model what the new structure is going to generate in terms of economic activity?
The change in the tax credit, the impact would have been incorporated in our overall macroeconomics that we use for our projections into the future, both from a size of the economy and.
So if you look at the old one and the new one, which one has a bigger economic impact on the province of Nova Scotia?
And so the economy of Nova Scotia grows, but I guess to put it in perspective, we're talking to a sector here that's, if we want to, 130, 150 million. The economy of Nova Scotia is 35 to 40 billion dollars.
Sure, but I'm trying to understand in that sector is from your analysis with the old way and the new way, and the size of the sector. Under the new way or under the old way, is the size of the sector bigger or smaller? Because I'm certainly hearing that the size of the sector is going to be a lot smaller. And I wonder if you did any analysis to look at how that may play out.
Mr. Rayfuse.
I'm going to ask Lalonde to answer that question, please.
So as part of the work related to the economic assumptions underlying the revenue estimates for the budget, we do economic modeling, which is contained in the budget documents.
Yeah, so sorry, I don't want to be, in the interest of time, I'm on time here. Do you have an analysis of how,
let me
is it
just
bigger or
explain
smaller?
what we would do. So currently, from Statistics Canada, the industry is around
Sorry.
0.14%.
The process is not as important to me as the end result. Do you know if the industry is bigger or smaller after this
What
change?
we modeled, so I will tell you what we modeled. We modeled the reduction in government spending and then the impact to GDP on the reduction in government spending. We do it on total government spending, and then we get the GDP estimate, so you can look at the GDP estimates that were produced.
Okay, so it sounds like there's no specific
We
analysis
don't
of what this
do
impact
by industry
on that
by industry. We're
You didn't
looking
look
at a
at,
macroeconomic
so there was nobody that
Order,
looked at.
order. We do need to keep a clear distinction of who's speaking. It's getting a bit out of hand. So, Mr. Houston, did you want to clarify and allow Ms. Kumaraniaki to answer?
No, I'll clarify and move on. So what I understand is that there was no specific analysis as to how this change would impact the industry. There was a broader analysis as to what happens to the whole GDP of the province, but nothing specifically for this industry. That's what I took there. So I did, for Mr. Rayfuse, the Broughton report made some recommendations around this tax credit. The minister chose to go a different way. Why was that? Was there any discussion of just going with the Broughton recommendations? Why did they scrap the Broughton recommendations and come up with their own?
Mr. Rayfuse.
The Broughton recommendations on the film are I'm going to say, not very specific in that area. Options were given to government for considerations around the film tax credit. The why they chose one, I think, is a public policy issue that would be best answered by the minister.
Okay, so the minister made a decision to move away from the 100% refundable, and that's fine. Okay, so I appreciate that. Back in November 2014, Minister Samson, then Minister of Economic and Rural Development, tabled a bill in the legislature, the film tax credit, that would have extended the film tax credit until 2020. He tabled that bill, it was Bill number 49 in November 2014, less than, I don't know how many months ago that was. Seems like a long time ago. But that act required somebody to be appointed to conduct a review of the film tax credit and recommend changes. So you had Broughton looking at this. You have an act before that was passed royal assent that said, let's get somebody to look at it. Did anybody look at it? Are you aware of any? Did you see any analysis that came as a result of Bill 49 that this government passed in November?
If I understand correctly, that a notion of having a review of the tax was in relation to the recently introduced corporate capital investment tax credit, not specific to the film tax credit. So that review was part of that tax credit, not this.
Actually, the bill was very specific on the film industry, that there be a review done. And in fact, it called for a new strategic framework to be submitted by March 1st from Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia. So it sounds like that framework, you never saw that framework.
Ms. Kumaraniaki.
So what that bill did was, the requirement around the evaluation, et cetera, was related to the 5-year strategic plan of Film and Creative Industries Nova Scotia.
Right.
It set a new time date for the timing for that plan. I know that Film and Creative Industries was working on that plan for submission as part of their planning. However, government made the decision to move those activities within Nova Scotia Business Inc. So
Okay,
going forward, that'll be reflected.
So they passed a bill, and a few months later, they did something else to completely change the spirit of the bill that they just passed. That's what we saw happen there. Just a final question quickly, Mr. Chair, is I know people in the industry, big company, employers.
I'm sorry, but we have run out of time. We'll move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. McDonald.
Thank you very much. I don't have a large number of questions. I think we're starting to get a picture here that the decision of the government to make the changes that they've made in the film tax credit really are driven by the program review. And so the decision that's been made is really that the film tax credit is a casualty of the program review of the government. It doesn't rest on any comprehensive analysis in terms of the economic impact that this industry has on the province. The data, the information that we have for that particular understanding is quite outdated, 2004. So I do want to just get a better appreciation of what the data is that we do have. Last year, how many companies were in receipt of the film tax credit?
Ms. Kumariniaki?
55.
55?
Yeah.
So last year, 55 companies were in receipt of the film tax credit. What were the number of tax filers last year, the personal tax revenue piece? The people who live and work in Nova Scotia, the I pay taxes to group. How many individuals does that represent?
Mr. Rayfuse?
The number of tax filers in Nova Scotia would be about 720,000. Total tax filers? Is that what
No, associated with the this
so
industry.
the industry. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Rayfuse?
I think we'd need to go back and up all the names on those applications that we were talking about, but I think that the industry standard indicates that there would be about 1,200.
Mr. Macbeth?
I'm just going to ask Mr. Macbeth.
Mr. Macbeth?
Yeah, we haven't done that detailed analysis of each individual application and everybody who's on there, but what the industry produces is a report, and they estimate the number of full-time equivalents in the industry, and their number for the entire industry, which includes aspects that aren't covered by the film tax credit per se, but that total industry of film and television production, according to the CMPA, is 1,140 for 2013 and 14.
So I don't want to be disrespectful, but I want to say you're kidding me. The Department of Finance, the government, have made a decision to have this impact on this sector, and we don't know how many people work in the sector in the province. We haven't done the analysis of that.
Mr. Macbeth? Or sorry, Mr. Rayfuse?
We know the number of individuals that are associated with the applications that are eligible for the film tax credit. You asked for the number of individuals working in the entire industry. That is an entirely different number. And that's the number we quote. We get that information from industry as the total sector. We use, when we do our analysis, is the individuals associated with the claims. So that's our analysis. I would not think it'd be appropriate to say we don't know the amount of people that are associated with claims.
So I get it. I mean, because the industry, when they apply, because it is a rebate on labor, we would obviously know what the number of people associated with those rebates are. But it seems to me that we should also know how many people are working and associated with this industry. But apparently we don't. What I would like to know is, of those 55 companies that filed last year, how many of them were able to take advantage of the rural incentive, and as well, how many were able to take advantage of the frequency incentive?
Mr. Rayfuse?
We don't have that with you, but we will certainly be able to provide that to the committee. Okay?
Thank you. Ms. McDonald?
Thank you very much. I think at this stage, I will turn it over to my colleague, my time.
Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I know we only have about 9 minutes, so I'll try to be as clear and concise as possible. Through this whole process around the film tax credit and the changes we see, one of the things that resonated with myself was the lack or the perceived lack of consultation. So would you not consider it reasonable and appropriate to consult with the industry, those artists, those Nova Scotians who are going to be affected by this when your department makes such a change to a program? Would you believe that would you agree that that would be reasonable and appropriate to do that consultation?
Mr. Raythews?
During the development of Laura Broughton's report, the author did meet with the industry and talk about the industry and the tax credit associated with it as well. During the minister's consultation sessions, the industry were able to attend those sessions, and as well, they did make submissions to both those processes, and the information, and also they were available to come to speak to the minister. We generally do not have, I'm going to call, run by a tax change with those implicated with the tax change. That's kind of not a process that we could facilitate because of the nature of taxes. But they were aware through those conversations that there was ongoing discussion around the tax credit.
I thank you for that, and the reason I kind of bring that up is we've been hearing a lot from the industry that they weren't consulted, and yes, there was a broad look at the tax system for the province, but I don't think the industry and those artists thought that the government would go after in such a way their piece of legislation. And I say that because, interesting enough, there is legislation on the books. Bill 1, which has no association with the Bill 1 that was just introduced by the Liberal government, that was introduced, and that was the status of the Artists Act, which I had the honor to introduce and table in this House, and it passed. And in that legislation, it indicates that the government undertakes, so far as it considers reasonable and appropriate, to work with the artists, artist association to guide and inform the government on matters relating to arts and culture. And the film and TV industry definitely, I think, relates to the arts and culture of our province. So I think the minister needs to recognize that and needs to ensure that we live up to legislation that is already passed through the House, that proper consultation does take place. Quickly on the film and creative industry, Nova Scotia. It was indicated earlier that they had been consulted over the last year, trying to streamline and trying to make sure that there's not duplication of roles and jobs. Where do you feel confident now that the department going into the future will be able to utilize, I believe only 3 people moved over to NSBI and 9 were fired. Do you feel that NSBI and those 3 people will be able to pick up and ensure that government into the future will have experts that can advise the department on potential future changes? Does that concern you, or are you going to look externally now at all consultation in the future? I mean, it's important to have experts within the government system, and I'm a bit concerned that the government chose to cut it so dramatically that, as I said, 9 people were fired, and I believe 3 moved over to NSBI. So, do you have any comment on that, maybe to relieve my concerns? I don't know if you'll be able to do that, but I'll leave it with you for comment.
Mr. Raythews?
Certainly, the domain of tax policy remains with the Department of Finance and Treasury Board, and we did use film and creative industries as a source of insight into things. I'm still confident that the fact that we'll be able to do so with NSBI. Their lens will be from a more of a rather than a sector specific. It will be more of a business as a whole type of a perspective. But I believe that we'll be able to have those ongoing conversations, and in fact, and there's also we'll have a relationship with those on the tourism, culture, and heritage side of the House as well.
Okay, thank you. Quickly, I know we only have a few minutes. The Broughton report had given some indication to the government on a number of changes, and we know that many of them the government chose not to implement. One of the ones that concerns me from not only my critic role now, but from my previous roles as Minister of Health was the elimination of the Healthy Living Tax Credit. Could you provide us the analysis that you use to cut a program that I believe is so important. I think it is an incentive for families to register their children in another activity. Having young kids myself, I know how expensive it is. So what kind of analysis was done to bring that recommendation forward for the government to say, here's a tax credit that is not working well in the province? So can you maybe I think you have 2 minutes, can you give me why going after a healthy living tax credit was a direction that the government went?
Mr. Rayfuse.
Certainly, and I don't have the analysis with me, but we can certainly table this. But generally speaking, when we look at that tax credit, and the original intention was that is to help those people in the lower income levels with the registration fees associated with those eligible programs. And when you do analysis of those who are benefiting from that, it was not those individuals that were benefiting from that tax credit. It was more of a middle and upper income individuals, and therefore it was determined that it wasn't reaching its objective, and consideration was given to it for its elimination.
Okay, and I look forward to going through that. I think
You have just over a minute.
Okay,
Mr.
a minute. One of the things that finance, I believe, is using is data that was available through the culture satellite account. Is that still a process that you utilize to use information from that satellite account?
I'm going to ask Mrs. Lalonde.
Yes, Ms. Kramariniaki.
Yeah, Finance is a member of the Interdepartmental Committee on Arts and Culture, and we work closely with Communities, Cultures and Heritage on that kind of satellite accounting. So we're part of that process within government.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We'll now move to the Liberal Caucus and Ms. Miller.
Thank you so much for being here today to answer all these questions. Coming into this, I didn't realize that that the opposition members would be focusing primarily on the film tax credit, although we expected a few of those kind of questions, considering the timing. But there are so many important things in the report and so many important things going on in Nova Scotia, so I want to focus on something different. And about our education. In our first budget, we embarked on a commitment to rebuild our education system after the $65 million cut in education previously, and we're putting $20.4 million in this year. Can you tell me how that aligns with the Broughton report, and what measures you find are the most noteworthy in that?
Mr. Rayfuse? Mr. Rayfuse.
Certainly in the Broughton report, it spoke to being able to have the flexibility for governments to address the priorities of government. So that's where the notion of holding the line on spending would allow you that kind of flexibility from a tax measure perspective and otherwise. That has played itself out into the government's commitment to put the extra or the $65 million back into the education sector, and by addressing spending on a whole of government perspective, it allows government to do that without having, I would call, a major detrimental impact on the spending. Spending is overall is essentially flat for the upcoming year. So.
All right, thank you. I'll pass on. My colleagues have questions too, and we only have a few minutes left. So,
Ms. Arab.
Thank you. Thanks for being here today. I have my first question. I have a few. My first question is just a general question about the consultation process. So once the report was presented, the minister and a number of MLAs had consultations around the province, and I'm wondering what was done with the feedback and what the general themes in the feedback were that you received.
Okay.
Mr. Rayfuse.
And for the benefit that don't know, during those public consultation sessions, there was a series of questions asked the participants. There was no attempt to provide consensus at the tables where those tables were asked, but there was a facilitator at those sessions, and he took all the comments back and has provided some feedback that is now available for public. And I'm going to ask Lalonde to go talk a little further about where we're at with that, but I think it's posted as well.
Ms. Komarniaki.
So the report itself, the feedback on the consultations that were held between January and March is actually on the department's website. It's prepared by Think Well. And there were a number of themes that came out of it in response to the questions. One around government spending and taking the feedback we got was taking a balanced approach. So not feeling that we need to, folks wanted us to take account of what's the impact on the most vulnerable. So a kind of a balance between looking and ensuring that we have careful government spending versus increasing taxes. So that was a main theme that came out. We had other themes related to things like there were questions around the pollution tax. And again, Nova Scotians, while we're willing to look at change, they wanted to think through what that would mean. They'd like to have government do a little bit more analysis, understand what's the impact and what would be a tax that would work in Nova Scotia. So those were some of the themes that would came through around the different types of questions and the report itself. And the report's just on the department website for folks to download.
Thank you. The budget made changes to the dividend tax credit. And we haven't really discussed that much today. I wanted to know if you could explain what eligible and non-eligible dividends are.
Okay.
Ms. Komarniaki.
Okay. So this is related to our personal income tax, and folks will receive dividends. If you receive dividends from Canadian public corporations, that's called eligible. If you receive dividends from other types of Canadian corporations, like small businesses, that's called non-eligible dividend tax credit. So that's the difference.
Okay, and why was this change made, and what's the impact going to be?
Okay, so when folks get dividends, if you to report in terms of taxable income, that the dividend income is not just the dividends, but also the pre-tax corporate income associated with that business. So essentially, folks are in that dividend, if you're being taxed, you're taxed on also what the corporation may pay. So to overcome that, the tax system has a tax credit. So against the dividend tax, you also get a tax credit. And the tax credit, what's happened is because we've lowered our small business tax rate over the last few years from 5% to 3%, what hadn't happened was the tax credit, which works against the taxable pay, that tax credit rate had not been adjusted. So while our small business rate was 3.0%, our tax credit rate was 5.87%. So what we've done now is lowered our tax credit rate to 3.5% on non-eligible dividend tax credits. It's to keep everything in lockstep.
So sorry, just bear with me, because I'm trying to figure this all out. And I have a lot of small businesses that are in my constituency. So is this something that's going to be harmful to the small businesses?
So
or?
what it is, first of all, it's for personal income taxes. So it's not related to the small business tax rate per se. It's not about the taxes that small business pay. It's around the personal income taxes. And what it speaks to is folks can decide whether to get their income through wages and salaries or through dividends. And from a tax system perspective, we want to make sure that when folks are paying tax, it doesn't matter whether they get it through wages and salaries or dividends. But because we hadn't adjusted the small business tax, the non-eligible dividend tax credit, we were actually incenting people to. There was almost a little bit of a loophole where they were getting more benefit if they chose to have their income through dividends rather than salaries. So what we've done is just made them comparable.
Excellent. Okay. I'll let my colleague ask some questions. Thank you.
Mr. Jessom.
Thank you. Through the chair, one of the most challenging pieces of this whole look at regulatory or regulations here in Nova Scotia for me, and I hosted a meeting in my riding with business and the public, and it's really challenging to harvest specific carrots or specific regulations when you're talking to people in general and when you're talking to business owners. And frankly, the report, I would suggest, focuses more on a review of regulation and a plan for review, and there's nothing at least to me, that pops out as, you know, highlighted regulations that cause chaos for businesses. Do you have a list of, I guess, specific regulations that were recommended to be reviewed?
Mr. Rafuse.
Certainly during the process that Ms. Broughton undertook in writing a report, one of the things we were asking every time we met with people is give us a specific regulation that you are telling that is creating this burden for you, and a lot didn't come forward. And the perception we were getting, she was getting, was it was just the layering effect, or the kind of the piling on of regulations, and where there would be a lack of a coordinated approach between departments. Therefore, there was no specific recommendations. It just to say get rid of this one. Her approach was you need to look at the burden overall, and you need to have some kind of centralized kind of gatekeeper on regulations, so that pile-on kind of effect doesn't occur.
Thank you. Through the chair, so there would in fact be a pool of recommended regulations to review?
There were some that were put forward for that group. We would have kept track of all those. I can certainly provide you that to you.
Yes, please.
One of them, I mean, I remember the tire one is one comes to mind, but yes, there would have been some.
Okay, thank you. Just curious, what evidence do you have to support? I mean, you can suggest that it, you know, economies just work that way, but what evidence was there that influenced the recommendation in the report to remove the top tax bracket?
Certainly what we were hearing, or what she was hearing during the review, was two things. The top bracket stood out as the highest tax bracket in Canada, or the highest rate, and so therefore it was when NSBI and others were encouraging companies to come here, that kind of stood out as a bit of an outlier from that perspective, and a lot of individuals were looking at it for, well, if I moved to Nova Scotia, I'm in that tax bracket. So that was relayed during the review as well. When that was brought in, it was viewed as being a bit of more of a temporary measure. If you recall, the surcharge was eliminated at the same time, and the notion would being is that if it's temporary, then one should get rid of that. That's what her view, and it also lessens the amount of brackets. And going back to the 4 principles given to her about making it more simplistic, the less brackets, the more simple.
Okay, thank you. Through the chair, also recommends a full inventory of assets and tangible, non-tangible. Has that process been commenced?
I do know that there has been some work done on certain assets that the province has, or that work would have been done through another department. But yeah, there is a beginning of an inventory around those, if one chose to go in that direction.
Thank you. Finally, through the chair, when it comes to establishing the list of stakeholders for this type of an activity, what goes into the decision of who gets to sit at the table?
During this consultation, Ms. Broughton chose not to do public consultation. She wanted to meet with others. So it was sort of, for the academics, we arranged through our academic connections with various universities. For the economists, we went through our network that we have with various economists in the banking system. When she met with businesses, we used local chambers to the extent possible to get in front of them, as well as our connections to the regional offices at the then ERDT, and their suggestions as to who would be individuals which she should meet with.
Okay, thank you. I'm all set.
Thank you, Mr. Jessamine. If there's no further questions, Mr. Rafuse will allow you an opportunity to provide closing comments.
My only closing comments is to thank the chair and the committee for the opportunity to come speak to the report.
Thank you for your time. You've been very informative for us all this morning. Thank you. We have a briefing after this meeting. Mr. Houston,
sorry, Mr. Chair, just to make sure that you the information requests on those numbers.
Yes, there were a number of mentions by Mr. Rayfuse and requests by committee members. As is regular practice, our clerk will review the transcript and ensure that there is follow-up on all of those requests. We do have a briefing on from the Auditor General's office on the in-student school information system. I recommend we try to start that before 11 o'clock if we can, in the interest of time. If everyone is ready here, we will start that immediately after the meeting. Our next meeting is on April 22nd. We have the Department of Natural Resources coming in to speak about mineral resources management. With that, we will adjourn for the Auditor General. Thank you.